Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video about deck themes and how sometimes they can lie to you. I wanted to investigate the reasons why we sometimes wind up with decks that just don't do what we think they'll do. And in that video, I said this. There's this undercurrent of hidden themes in EDH decks, times where it almost feels like a deck is lying to you a little bit, and which causes us to misunderstand what our deck needs and perhaps even accidentally misrepresent what our deck does. I think there are two reasons why this happens. One that comes from Wizards of the Coast, and one that comes from the player base. But they're each complicated enough that I think they both require their own individual videos to tackle properly, so this video will be about the players part, and you can keep your eye out for the Wizards one soon enough. Well, wouldn't you know it, now it's time for part 2. In that last video, I tackled the ways that we as players sometimes mislead ourselves about deck themes. In this video, I'd like to unpack why we as players sometimes wind up with those decks that just don't do what we hope, but not because it's our fault, it's just because of the ways that those cards were designed. In that video, I also said that you should like and subscribe too, which is a thing I'm actually going to repeat again here because I can see that you're tapped out and you don't have mana up to counterspell my call to action, so you should have played around it if you wanted to stop it. Sorry, you gotta click the thing now, it's just the rules. Alright, let's get to business. If you, the internet, are willing to permit it, I would like to propose that this conundrum is complicated. Game design is complex. I'm sure I could have gone the route of naming this video something like The Failures of Commander Design or something like that, but I don't know. I know it'd be more eye-catching, but also like, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of egregious and obvious problems in card design that I think could and should have been sidestepped. But lots of problems are not obvious. And pretending that we'd never have made those same errors is probably neither accurate nor helpful. Distancing ourselves like that would only prevent us from seeing the pitfalls that we ourselves can also sometimes fall into during gameplay, during our regular lives. And that's not the tone that I'd like to set here. I'd rather that we be inquisitive than accusatory, because in my experience, players who are inquisitive are a lot better at Magic. So let's investigate. What are things that occasionally happen in the card design stage that sometimes prevent a deck from being able to click? In my head, I've been calling this specific conundrum the Tivit problem. A classic case of a commander that looks like one thing, it looks like it's a voting commander, but it turns out to be something else entirely. What do I mean here? Well, let's walk through the design from scratch. Say you're finally able to design at long last a commander that cares about voting cards. So you slap on an easy and compelling line of text. You get additional votes, so you can finally play all those neat voting effects like Will of the Council and Council's Dilemma cards from conspiracy sets in a neat commander deck that cares about those cards. But you as a designer realize, well, there aren't actually that many voting spells, and you don't have the space to make a whole bunch more alongside the release of Tivit. I mean, this is just the backup commander for the New Capenna Obscura Precon after all. So to make this character do some voting stuff during the game, you make the card do some voting on its own. It has to enable a vote somehow. And because one of the themes of New Capenna involves treasure tokens, you throw that on as one of the possible rewards for the votes. But of course, if you're making treasures, you've probably got to make the mana cost kind of high. I mean, we don't want a Dockside Extortionist effect in the command zone now, do we? And well, since the commander is kind of expensive now, maybe we'll also give it some extra defenses. The dominoes have fallen, and we wind up with Tivit, who enters and immediately makes 5 artifact tokens. So, okay, what do we actually have here? What did we end up with? Ostensibly, it's a commander that cares about voting, except when all is said and done, the fact that you get additional votes is now the least important part of the entire card. You could play some voting cards in this deck, and admittedly some folks still do, but if we're being honest about what this deck is, it's a blink deck. Displacer Kitten shows up in way more Tivit decks than any voting spell. Some of the most popular cards in the deck are Ephemerate, Teleportation Circle, and Tivit makes 5 artifact tokens with that ability, so things like Academy Manufactor are way more clutch and way more popular in Tivit decks than any voting card. Aside from basic removal like Swords to Plowshares, the super most popular card in Tivit decks is Time Sieve, which shows up in 71% of Tivit decks because, yeah, of course it does. If you called this a voting commander or a voting deck, I'm sorry, the evidence kind of forces me to disagree with you. I'd have to call it a blink deck, an artifact tokens deck, not a voting deck. I'm glad we eventually got the Valiard to give voting decks another option that isn't quite so overrun with metal and blink and combos, because those things really prevented Tivit from being what it wanted to be. Those elements and what they can do or what they enable in gameplay completely overshadow the voting aspects of this design. As a more recent example, the new Stella Lee has some of the very same qualities. Ideally, she's a spell slinger that wants you to chain a few things together in a single turn so that you can copy a fun spell, and naturally, you'd maybe want to include some cards that can untap her so that you can copy something more than just one time. Except, wait a second, once you add those in, oh, right, they go infinite with her. If Stella Lee copies a card like Cerulean Wisps or Refocus or one of the many versions of that effect, the copy untaps her and lets you draw a card. Then she can copy that card again since the original spell is still on the stack, and that copy will untap her and you'll draw a card, lather, rinse, repeat, you draw your whole deck. Or if you use something like Twisted Fealty to enable this, then the repeated untapping and constant cycling through infinite Wicked Roll tokens will just win you the game right then and there too. I can't really say that's a spell slinger strategy or even a storm strategy. Cards like Fealty and Wisps are the most popular cards that people are putting into Stella Lee decks, and with a high enough density of those effects, I mean, yeah, that's a combo deck. This is actually something we've kind of seen before with Calamax too. Put in a single spell that can copy something, and suddenly Calamax is infinitely huge. And like, Calamax is asking for you to copy spells, so of course you'd want to add in cards that can copy spells, but as soon as you do the thing that the commander is after, you've oopsed into a completely different strategy than just Spellslinger. To briefly name some other infamous examples, Najeela is rarely a warrior deck. Her first line of text would be good enough to just be a fantastic warrior commander. If she was just that, even just mono red, she'd still be great. But then she also happens to have that second effect, so the most popular cards in her deck are not usually warriors, they're infinite combat makers. To be frank, near any commander that has uncapped activated abilities often ends up with this sort of fate. I cannot call Gave a tokens or a +1 counters deck, you know? It's frankly hard to find a Gave deck that doesn't contain infinite combos just by accident. Okay, but we shouldn't just linger on combos, right? They've been talked about to death, but I think it's also safe to say that Korvold being originally billed as the leader of a, quote, Johnny food token deck is a bit laughable, nor is Chulainn the adventure-enabling commander that it was presented as. There isn't a single adventure creature on its EDH Rec page, in fact. I can't say for certain whether Xyrus was intended to be a political commander, but well, one of those lines of text leads me to believe that it was, even though the other line of text makes the very idea of ever even having to attack with Xyrus a totally foreign concept. Xyrus can make 20-ish tokens from a single wheel spell and is able to practically forget that it has any combat damage trigger effect at all. Pyr and Toothy are ostensibly a +1 counter deck at a glance, except if you use a blink effect on Toothy, which makes it leave and enter all as one effect, then you'll trigger a billion instances of card draw, which Toothy will actually see and then resupply itself with even more counters, helping you find more blink spells and of course probably some kind of Labman style win condition. Or how often do you see an Anya deck that actually casts those madness spells instead of just churning through them as fodder to dig into the deck for its best cards? Or have you played against the new Tetsun card yet? On its face, a very simple way to play a bunch of double-sided artifacts, right? A silly theme that you don't see very often. Well, the inevitable play pattern of this deck is closer to what I, and apparently others, would call a storm deck. I actually played against Brian Kibler's first draft of his Tetsun deck, and he dug through more than half his deck by turn 5 without even trying very hard. A thing that took all of us at the table, including him, by surprise. So okay, what am I really getting at here? That some of these cards are too powerful? Well, no, that's not the point at all. Power is not the problem. What I'm talking about is deck identity. Like, Edgar Markov overshot the power mark, but you can't deny it's still a vampire deck. Joda the Unifier is bonkers, like, why does it have that many words on it? But if you look at its data, you're still seeing a deck that plays a ton of legends, which is exactly what the commander advertises. For both of them, they are kind of a little bit out of control on the power level, like, probably could have been reined in a little bit more, but the deck identity is crystal clear. Whereas with those Tivit or Tetsun examples, their deck identity is more muddled. The things that they aimed for aren't necessarily where they landed. A voting deck instead became a blink artifact tokens list. A double-faced artifacts deck became a storm list. Again, it's not about power levels. This doesn't just happen when things accidentally dip into storm or combo territory. For instance, Vela is not what I'd ever call an overpowered commander, but she certainly didn't land where she was intended either. She was released in a deck literally called Knight of the Ninja, but her page is all Eldrazi and colorless creatures. She was ultimately just a little too underwhelming for ninja strategies, so she wound up somewhere completely different. Or take Arkelos, definitely not a broken commander, but it too has a weird deck identity. The designers announced that they made Arkelos Sultai instead of Bant, even though white does more things with tapping than black ever has, because they wanted Arkelos to do things with, for instance, tapped zombie tokens, which is, you know, a choice that was made. But Arkelos' deck data? It's all landfall. There's nothing on the page that cares at all about getting tokens in untapped or even punishing opponents when you force their stuff to enter sideways. The most popular cards in the deck are Scoot Swarm and Tatyova. Arkelos' ability works fine on cool lands, but its other desired outcomes were left far, far behind. So this changing of a commander's deck identity from what it might have been intended as versus where it winds up can come up in times where a thing turns out to be actually way broken and goes into like a combo or whatever, but it comes up in plenty of other ways too. Now, so far, I've alleged that this part of the muddled deck identity issue is something that's come from the wizards and card design side of things, rather than from the players side of things. I've done a video about like player habits. That was the part 1 if you want to check that out. And again, this video is about investigating a little bit further up that stream to see what other things can kind of cause this from down on high, I suppose. And I've provided examples that I hope the average person will find fair, but at the same time, I mean, I did not create these cards. I cannot say what they were intended to do with 100% certainty. I'm not telepathic. I don't know exactly what's in any given designer's mind. I think that plenty of these cards are fairly self-evident, and I've also put some supporting material onto the screen for the examples that I thought maybe needed a little bit more of that, like, oh yeah, here's some stuff that we can read about what the designers were thinking. But nonetheless, if you think that any of my assessments about what these cards were aiming for is like way off, if you think I'm way wrong about that, fair enough, I guess. Obviously, though, I am confident in my assessments here. I do feel a big degree of distance between what cards seemed to be trying to do and where they wound up. I find it comical, for instance, for Corvold to have been described as, quote, a Johnny commander, and I don't think that the extra vote effect was the last thing that they added to Tivit's design file. The ultimate question, though, and a thing that many people have probably already typed in the comments because they were too impatient to watch an entire video and listen to a complete argument before chiming in themselves to tell me what an idiot I am for not mentioning a thing that I do in fact mention in the video after all, is whether this is actually an issue with the designs or if this is once again an issue with player behavior. If players wanted to build Tivit as just a voting deck, they still could, right? Is the issue actually wizards designing something kind of funky, or is the issue that players are sometimes just not able to control themselves? After all, there are tens of thousands of cards in Magic. Everything in the Commander format is super breakable. Combos exist left, right, and center. So who's to say a bunch of these examples aren't just another case of players optimizing every deck within an inch of its life, solving the commanders within the first 10 minutes of their debut? Like I said, the issue's complex. So here's a distinction I'd like to make. I'll use Estrid as my example. What comes to mind when you see Estrid? Enchantress, right? Auras, untapping your enchanted stuff, getting enchantments back from the graveyard. But to some players, Estrid is famous for being a stacks enabler. Play a Stasis or a Winter Orb, and then with her plus ability, you're the only one who will be able to untap your resources. She's even famous for doing combos with the Chain Veil. Enchant and untap it and all your lands, activate it over and over again to use her ability a bazillion times, and you can go totally wild. Super easy to turn this commander from one identity, Enchantress, to another identity like stacks or combo. But it's also really easy to avoid that. Just don't play those. And then, boom, she functions just fine as an Enchantress deck. That is a really easy off switch. The issue is not Estrid, it's not her design. The issue is a tiny number of cards that she could be pretty busted with, but if you just avoid them, it's all good. Her deck identity is still really clear. Now let's go back to Gave Guru of Spores. If we were to try and avoid all Gave's combos, we couldn't just take out one or two problem cards, you know? And here are some numbers to back that up. Are y'all familiar with the site Commander Spellbook? It's a log of infinite combos that the community helps to compile. It's a neat resource, and it can inform you whether your deck contains any infinite combos. You can just plop your deck list in, and it'll show you any that happen to pop up there. I ran Estrid's average deck through this site, and it came up with one result. The Chain Veil combo that I mentioned earlier is the only combo that commonly appears in Estrid decks with any regularity. And we can actually see from EDHREC that only 31% of players are actually using the Chain Veil in Estrid decks. So only about a third of Estrid players are actually actively using this combo. Commander Spellbook also showed me a list of other potential combos that could exist in this average deck if you were to add just one more card in, and there were 21 of those, 18 of which were infinite combos. Then I ran Gave's average deck list through the Commander Spellbook, and it showed that the average number of combos in a typical Gave deck is 34. Not only that, but the list of other potential combos that it could have if you were to add in just one more card totaled to 208, all of which either go infinite or win the game outright. That's the difference I'm talking about. For one of these commanders, you can yoink out a single card and you're fine. But for the other, trying to avoid combos means gutting the entire deck and dodging a field of landmines. So that is effectively the line I'm trying to draw. If an Estrid player is doing a combo thing, that reads to me as they went out of their way to do that. But if a Gave player is doing a combo thing, that reads to me as yeah, of course they are, because it's hard not to. They'd have to go out of their way to not do that. They'd have to go out of their way to make it just a tokens and counters deck. So applying that to our other examples, if I see a Tivit player who is trying to make it just a voting deck, or I see a Calamex player that's trying to not go infinite, that reads to me the same way that the Gave example does. That reads to me as players who are having to go out of their way to do so. Plus, to defend players even more here, let's talk about the Mimeoplasm. Lots of people are using this as an ooze commander, even though its abilities are kind of terrible for oozes, but players just want a place to play their jank. Or do you remember how for years players used Karametra as an enchantress deck because there weren't yet any Selesnya commanders that cared about enchantments? How many players used Tuvasa as the leader of a merfolk deck just because there wasn't yet a Bant commander that explicitly cares about merfolk? When Kumena and eventually Hawkball came out, that certainly relieved some of the pressure from Tuvasa, but I've still absolutely seen people use her as their merfolk deck leader. These choices aren't about optimization. Players just want their silliness to have a good home. So yes, it's true, players can absolutely optimize the fun out of a game if given enough opportunity, and that's something that I explored a bit more in the Part 1 video. But they don't always do that. You're never able to fully predict how a thing that you make will be received, whether it's a piece of art or a card game design. And this makes it really hard for game designers to create something that isn't super breakable. And at a certain point, you can't regulate every single thing anymore. And honestly, even if you try, the player base is so huge that they'll find stuff that you missed in like a matter of minutes. And there are things you can do that help avoid these pitfalls. Any commander with an activated ability, especially a completely neutral activation cost, I mean, that's just begging to become an infinite mana sink. So maybe avoiding those is a technique to help make sure that you don't accidentally produce a combo enabler. Or anytime that an ability says whenever you X do Y and that ability doesn't have a cap on it, and especially if the reward is drawing cards, then you're almost assuredly leaving the doors open for combo territory. And in some of those cases, I do wish that the door wasn't quite so wide open, but I also understand that it's not always feasible, practical, or possible to close all of those doors completely without making a lot of other sacrifices. For instance, Magic players are fast to criticize how wordy cards can be these days. But in some cases, those extra paragraphs are restrictions that force those cards into being a lot more niche and not too overreaching. Complexity creep and power creep are not the same things. Sometimes they coincide, but not always. Sithis is very simple, but I don't like how powerful they made that card. While Saruman of Many Colors is very tricky to read properly, but a lot of his text is actually made up of riders to stop him from being too good. And I guess, in terms of sacrifices to make, I'll take extra wordiness if it means fewer power level problems. So I have a lot of sympathy for the difficult choices designers have to go through when making one of the biggest, best, and most hyper-scrutinized games in the entire world. And I have plenty to say about players and our bad habits and the things that we need to improve upon too. But I also have a lot of sympathy for the players too, and what we get put through. We work with what we're given, you know? I was talking with Rachel Weeks recently, and the conversation turned to one of our shared pet peeves, which is commanders that solve their own equations. They kind of give you everything that they need to do, they do it all for you, they tell you everything you need to know right on a single card. And an example that she mentioned was actually Shelob, which I've mentioned a couple of times on the show before too, and so have my co-hosts on the podcast. It's a commander that gives small abilities to your spiders, and then it has this whole paragraph about stealing your opponent's stuff and turning them into food tokens with abilities and stuff like that. And that became her consternation. That became the focus of the conversation. Like, what is this commander's deck identity? Is it a spider deck? Because what other spiders does it even need? You can just make it a fight deck. Sheila, it needs to be in play anyway, right? So she can do that stealing all on her own. I mean, we love a versatile commander. It is neat that Shelob can go in multiple different build paths. A lot of commander designs are super niche these days, so it is neat that this one actually has multiple branches that you can go into. And in fact, the data currently shows that a lot of people are still using this one as a spider commander. I just personally can't help but wonder whether or not that might change or be affected or fade over time, because much like Tivit's voting effect getting overshadowed by its artifact production, I, much like Rachel, have found that the spider part of this card can be kind of overshadowed by its second paragraph during gameplay. Like, to enable those abilities, players might actually end up finding that sometimes the spider stuff that they were so invested in the first place actually gets in the way of what the commander can really do, and those things aren't necessarily in harmony with each other. And at a certain point, when commanders are having a whole bunch of extra text added to them, they are fundamentally changing away from what it seems like they were there to do in the first place. I just get bummed when I see players strain against that tension, and it makes me wonder how many of those extra words were necessary for us as players to have been happy with the thing that we got. That first paragraph on Shelob still would have been a terrific place for all of the people who just want a silly spider deck. When getting a commander to do something cool means pulling away from what drew you to that card in the first place, yeah, that just starts to feel like a bummer. Sometimes we as players are responsible for false notions, bad habits, places where we misled ourselves and swam up the wrong stream. But sometimes you can't fight against an undertow, and card design trends are a very, very powerful current indeed. So at the end of all this, when we as players encounter those moments where a deck just isn't clicking, it's not doing what we'd hoped it would, take care to observe your own expectations of a commander, your own expectations of what a deck should do. But also, I hope that thinking like a game designer will help you more critically examine the commanders that you are faced with and see what it is that they are asking of you and how well they achieve their goals too. Hopefully, a stronger understanding of both those sides of the coin will help you better locate decks that perform the way you want them to. That's it from me. I hope we've been inquisitive together today. I'm keen to hear what you think about these commanders, and if you have any other examples of ones that perchance missed the mark and how you navigated those situations. Remember again to like and subscribe, hit up the comments below, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.